Hi class. This screencast is on management of dairy cows and also the production of dairy products. The reading is from Dameron chapter 17, so that's the chapter in the book that corresponds with this information. First, we're going to talk about the dairy industry. There are quite a few objectives that you should be able to get from this lecture. First, you want to identify major components of the industry and understand some basic management techniques. There is a role for genetics and reproduction. You also want to be able to describe the feeding of a dairy cow and how it affects overall management, and then describe the goals of a dairy herd health program. We're going to discuss some of the diseases and especially talk about problem of mastitis. Now, the dairy industry is third in animal industries behind the beef and poultry and eggs. The United States produces approximately 14% of the world's cow milk. Dairy cattle also produce beef, so 18 to 22% of the U.S. total beef in the U.S. comes from cull dairy cows and Holstein calves that are fed out in commercial feedlots. Most veal comes from dairy calves fed all milk diets and then slaughtered when they weigh a few hundred pounds. Now, the dairy industry is changing, and there's been trends over the last few years. This chart goes all the way back into the 1980s, and there have been trends that the number of operations has been decreasing. But on each operation, there's been more cows, and we'll see that here. So the number of dairy cows is decreasing, while the amount of being milk produced as well as the total number of cows is increasing. The charts on the left, though, you can see figure 17.8 shows you just that the number of cows is decreasing, but the next one shows you that although the number of cows is decreasing, the amount of milk being produced and the million pounds are both increasing at a positive rate. Now, this increase in production is due to three major factors. First is improvements in management and specifically nutrition, but also genetic improvements. About 60% of this increase is due to genetics, and then the other 40% we can attribute to the management. There are two major breeds in the United States. The first is the Holstein breed. It's a very large cow. It's the black and white one you're seeing here on the left. They are accustomed to being fed high concentrate diets and a total mixed ration, which you'll see as well. And they are very high milk producers. The next major breed in the U.S. is Jersey, but that still only accounts for about 4%. The Jersey cow is a much smaller cow. It produces less milk, and the constituents of the milk are a little different. Jersey cows are known for having a bit more fat in their milk. This chart just shows the top dairy producing states within the U.S. First, we have California, followed by Wisconsin, then New York, Idaho, and Pennsylvania. Now, as I previously mentioned, dairy cows' nutrition is very strongly managed, very controlled within the industry. Now, when we think of managing nutrition of a dairy cow, we mostly think of managing it during lactation, because profitability of an enterprise, the enterprise comes from the cows being in milk or milking constantly as much as possible. Now, in the industry, when the cows are raised in an intensive manner, they're fed what's referred to as a total mixed ration, and this is where basically all the nutrients are ground up and put together in one feed and then all fed together. So you can see this on the right. These animals are fed a total mixed ration, which would have their roughages, whatever is used. A lot of times it's silage, as well as the concentrates all mixed together. In doing this, each bite that the animal takes has all of the nutrition, all the different components in one. Now, extensively reared cows are fed forages. New Zealand is a major country that is known for having extensively reared dairy cows, where they are fed out on pasture and then brought in to milk. In the dairy industry, there are also semi-intensive and semi-extensive operations, which, as you know, contain components of both. Again, feed cost for dairy cows is expensive. We talked about feed being expensive a couple weeks ago, but it can account to 45 to 65% of the total cost. Managing feed is the most important factor in determining profitability within the dairy herd. There are many different forages that can be fed. Most common are alfalfa, lespedeza, oats, barley, corn forage, sorghum, and various other grasses. The most common grains fed in the United States are corn, sorghum, small grains, soybean meal, and cottonseed meal. This is a chart referring to how we manage nutrition during lactation. As we look at the chart, on the x-axis is the month of lactation, and then on the y-axis is just kind of a relative units. The white bar is milk production. This is a milk curve, which you all would have seen last week in the reproduction module. And then the yellow is dry matter intake, which is how much the animal can consume during that time. Now we have the different stages. So parturition occurs at month 0. Then we have this phase 3. Phase 4 is where milk production peaks, and then phase 5 is where the dry matter intake will peak. Finally, phase 6, which is tail end, dry matter intake and milk production are both decreasing rather rapidly. Now, also the other one I would point out is the body weight. It'll decrease in the first phase, increase a little bit during phase 5, and then will start to go back up during phase 6 as the animal heads towards the end of milking. Now in early lactation, again, days 14 to 100, so that would be in this area. This is where peak production. And what you notice here is that the intake is lagging. So the milk is peaking, but they're having a harder time being able to consume enough milk or consume enough dry matter to be able to keep up with the production of milk. In this stage, the cows are in what we refer to as a negative energy balance, which you all learned about during the nutritional section. And the cows are losing weight because they can't keep up consuming enough nutrients to meet the demands of early to peak milking. Remember, a negative energy balance is where the demand for energy is higher than the amount of energy consumed. In this stage, a cow will mobilize its reserves or the fat on its body, and that's how it starts losing weight. In mid-lactation, days 100 to 200, that would be in here. There's no longer a negative energy balance. You can see that the dry matter intake has surpassed the milk production line. In this point, it's important to make sure a producer will maintain the fiber, but the protein requirements for these animals has decreased. From a production standpoint, the goal of feeding during lactation is to maintain as high milk production for as long as possible. For each extra kilogram of milk at peak production, the average cow produces 200 to 225 kilograms more milk for the entire lactation period. So that translates to money on a production standpoint. Now during late lactation, 200 to 305 days more or less, cows will start to gain weight again. And feeding high amounts of protein and energy is not as critical during this period because they are decreasing milk production while also having a higher, relatively high dry matter and nutrient intake, so they're beginning to gain weight again. Now this is just the nutrient guidelines for lactating dairy cows. You can see the average milk yield decreases over the stage of lactation, and so does the dry matter intake, and we were able to see some of this over in the last chart. Crude protein is a lot more critical early on, but not so much later, as well as just the ruminal undegraded protein. So protein overall much higher at the beginning than later in the mid and late lactation. Fibers remain relatively stable or steady throughout lactation, and energy decreases a little bit, but not a ridiculous amount. If you feel like you want to look at the rest of this chart, you're going to have to, but it's not necessary to read it or memorize it for this course. Now, in the dairy industry, reproduction is an area of difficulty because as an animal is being milking, it's not naturally wanting to breed. There's another problem too, whereas in recent years, as producers in the industry was breeding cows over and over again, breeding for milk production and milk quality or milk constituents, they inadvertently bred against reproduction or reproductive ability and fertility. So like I said, the problems plagued the industry. Because we know that a cow must have a calf to produce milk, so they have to be able to reproduce. And because the milk production will decrease over time, producers want to have that cow with calf at frequent intervals to be able to initiate a new cycle of milk production. If the cow is not milking and it's not pregnant to have another baby, it's basically just costing money to a producer. But in breeding for milk production, like I said, they inevitably selected against reproductive efficiency, so it becomes harder and harder for producers to get their females pregnant. Realistically, in the industry, in the dairy industry specifically, they try to have dairy cows produce a calf at 13-month intervals. Now that's hard because the harder a dairy cow is working to produce milk, the higher productive, the less with the genetics that they're able to reproduce, it's harder to get dairy cows pregnant earlier during the production cycle. So nutrition is essential in managing reproduction. As we saw previously, the cow will lose weight during the first weeks after calving because it's not able to eat enough to produce the milk during early lactation. And this can create problems because the dairy cow must obtain and maintain certain body condition to be able to prepare the cow to undergo estrous cycles, to show heat, and to become pregnant. Most dairy cows are artificially inseminated because there are challenges with being able to detect heat within these animals, and estrous synchronization can help with this problem. It also gives producers more control over the calving interval, as well as being able to manage when the cows are able to basically produce another calf to be able to continue milk production. Now cows when they're heifers, or replacement heifers, means that they are going to soon go into the herd and be the next milking cows. When they're young, they have to be managed to mate and then have their first calf by 2 years old. That's the normal industry standard. Therefore, they'd have to be mated successfully by 15 months of age, And when they do this, they have to be at least 65% of their mature weight to be able to successfully become pregnant, carry the calf, have a calf, and efficiently go through that first milking cycle. Dairy cows are freshened year round, and the gestation period does vary from breeds, but it can go from 280 to 283 days, so the variation is not very big. There are some diseases that affect reproductive efficiency, and some of these are even zoonotic, so they can be a big issue. Brucellosis is also known as Bang's disease. For the most part, it's been eradicated in the U.S. It has been eradicated throughout all of domestic herds, but occasionally it'll pop up in wild population, especially of deer and moose. Campylobacteriosis, leptospirosis, IBR-BBD complex, and trichomoniasis are also other issues, other diseases that affect dairy cow that specifically hinder reproductive efficiencies. Now, part of managing dairy cows is also managing their replacements. These are the young heifers, like I said, that will be raised, bred to be the next round of milking cows. Neonates are the ones that are just born. They're usually pulled from their dam or their mother within the first 24 hours of calving. And they give them a little bit of period of time because they need to have the colostrum to be able to pick up that passive immunity. Now, the calves that are going to become producing cows are fed something called a milk replacer, and it's basically synthetic milk with all of the nutrients needed for these heifers, these young heifers. They're fed typically 2 times a day, and then they have dry feeds so that as soon as they'll be willing to want to start creep feeding or eating that dry feed, then they are allowed. But remember, we did talk about how the ruminant stomach is monogastric, and it's got to switch to a ruminant stomach to be able to, as the calf ages. And so that kind of is there to help with the transition. If there's a little bit of feed present, that once the calf feels like it's ready, it can start nibbling on the feed to help with the development of its digestive system. Calves are initially housed in hutches, so they're pulled from the dam, and you can see a picture here. These are calving hutches. In managing the young calves, it is advantageous from a production standpoint to get the calves the concentrates and forages as soon as possible. And this is because it's cheaper and easier. The housing is different. They don't have to bottle feed or go out and use the milk replacers, and it takes less labor to manage the animals. Now, again, the problem with this is the fact that they do have that monogastric stomach at first, so there has to be a transition in the gastrointestinal tract. Again, they're offered dry feed early and then weaned once they will consume enough of the dry feed. Females are typically going to be the replacements, and the heifers are placed in groups where they're all grown together until they are bred and then calved into the milking group. Males are also sold for veal, or they'll go to a feedlot where they are fed out to be finished for beef products. Now, it's important to always manage herd health, especially in the dairy industry. And programs basically need to be holistic, where the herd health concerns management, nutrition, medicine, vaccinations, etc., as well as controlling the environment. The general principles of the comprehensive herd health program include prevention rather than treatment. That's not specific to the dairy industry. That is completely across the board. Next is planned health-related procedures and examinations. And finally, always, 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 no matter what you're doing, keep records. Now, there are some major diseases within the industry. First is mastitis, and we will talk about that a bit more here in a minute. Next is milk fever, also referred to as hypocalcemia, which is not enough calcium. It occurs most commonly in dairy cattle, and this happens around the time of parturition. They undergo a sudden drop in their calcium because milk production begins, and it can interfere with the normal nerve and muscle function. Affected cows will go through a period of restlessness, muscle tremors, and become able to stand. It's also possible that this can cause death if untreated. Another one that happens is displaced abomasum, and the abomasum is relatively loosely kind of attached on the side of the body there by the rumen, and it can be displaced when there's excessive gas accumulation. It can affect the function and motility of the animal. It can be painful. There are quite a few digestive issues that can arise. Johne's disease, this was one of the diseases discussed when we did our health and disease section a couple weeks ago. It is highly contagious, and it's unique that they become infected when they are very young, but they do not develop signs until they are old, at least 2 years of age. It's easy for cows to go undetected when they have this disease, and there's no effective treatment. So typically all the animals would have to be sent to slaughter. We've talked about it previously, though. You have to have a special slaughter facility. They can't simply just go through like any cow. So it can be a major headache. So for milking, there's a video on how dairy cows are milked. You will watch this as part of the module. But a major issue, as we talked about before, is this concept of mastitis. So mastitis is simply inflammation in the mammary gland, but it's a very big problem in the industry. There are many things that can cause mastitis, but it's basically kind of an infection. So various agents could be bacteria. Oftentimes it is a bacteria that's common in the environment, but during times of stress or other issues, it can kind of take hold of the animal and be very problematic, cause a big infection. This picture shows a cut surface of the udder, and it's affected by mastitis. So here in the middle you can see the pus and an infection, as well as this is just a very unhealthy section of mammary tissue. Mastitis can also get so bad that it causes gangrene. And this one is called by Staph aureus. But again, you can see the kind of the necrotic tissue on the outside. This cow would not be able to milk. If it could milk, you would not want the milk that comes out of it because it'd be riddled with bacteria. Now, this picture is sequential milk samples collected from cows from 6 to 36 hours after they were infected with E. coli into one specific quarter of the mammary tissue. Now, the bacteria numbers peaked in the second vial from the left, though if you look at the milk still appears normal, and the cow was asymptomatic. So it's easy for producers, for these cows to be able to be sent through, be milked like normal, and the milk enter into the stock. Now, this is why in the industry there's something called a somatic cell count, or an SCC, which is the amount of basically white blood cells that are put out into the milk, and that's an indication of the infection load of that animal. In the industry, once the cows have been milked, they go into a vat. All of the milk ends up being tested for this somatic cell count prior to being sent into a plant for processing. Now this is showing samples from a cow with clinical mastitis. You can see mild to clinical. You can see it starts getting foggy, milky. There's some infection, and the milk will then even start to form these fibrin clots. So for the prevention of mastitis, management is always important. You want to prevent transmission. Mastitis, if an animal has mastitis and they're cupped on to be milked, you take those cups off, put them on another cow, you can transmit the disease. It's important to always use an effective, in the industry, this is why there's a germicide used to treat the teats after, simply because of this. And routinely cleaning the milking equipment and maintaining that equipment is necessary. Routinely cleaning bedding. If an animal has this bacteria in its teat, its milk, it lays down on bedding, gets up, another cow comes and lays down, it can easily transmit the disease. Treating and removing the udders, avoiding areas that will accumulate water, that can be a problem for the bacteria, maintaining behavior or the stalls, and then preventing frostbite and fly exposure. All of these can help prevent the incidence of mastitis. The treatment is simply an antibiotic, typically, especially if it's a bacteria in the environment, put up into the teat while the animal is being treated or has mastitis. All of the milk has to be dumped. So that milk will go into another vat or another bucket and take it and be dumped. It cannot go into the stock that's going to be sent to be processed. Now, it can create problems as well, because using that equipment to milk the cow, that equipment then has to be treated and cleaned. There are quite a few dairy products that exist, and they have some nutritional benefits. Of course, a cup of milk, this is 1 cup at 2% fat milk. There's 125 calories, but it provides other nutrients. Now, these nutrients are based on the allowance for a 19 to 30-year-old man. So there's 14% protein of the requirements for protein, 32% for phosphorus, 37% for calcium. Those are some big ones. There's also zinc, riboflavin, thiamine, and vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is very high in milk. There are some consumption trends, though. Milk is consumed by other products as well. Fluid milk or fresh milk is very big in the United States, though it may not be as big in other countries. Some countries, it's more common for the milk to be dried, and then once it's drank, it's reconstituted to, well, either be drinking or used in cooking. There's also cheeses, ice cream, yogurt, other creams, etc. The fluid milk consumption has declined steadily over the last few years, and it's more popular for consumers to have milk of lower fat rather than that of whole milk. Cheese consumption is increasing, and the amount used to make cheese is greater than that of fluid milk and cream since late 1980s. The milk used for cheese now accounts for over half of the end product use of raw milk. Now, consumption trends have changed over the years, but you can see overall, it's like we just mentioned, overall the total milk has decreased, whereas whole milk has also decreased, but lower fat and fat-free milk consumption has increased. Now, the total consumption trends of cheeses, you can see all the cheeses are increased. American cheese, is increased at a lower rate than other cheeses, but across the board, all cheese is increasing. Now, this is about the pasteurization process, which is a process where milk is heated and cooled to be able to kill any bacteria that may be present. That's why pasteurization is important. You will learn more about pasteurization within the module. It is the partial sterilization of the product to help make it more safe for consumption and can increase the shelf life. These videos on pasteurization are included within this module, but they will talk about the history of it as well as some different processes associated with pasteurizing milk. Now, environmental concerns are quite big in the dairy industry, especially for intensive production systems. And that's kind of the same across the board for intensive systems. There can be an industry. Now, waste disposal is the major concern, and that's because being in an intensive situation and laying stalls on concrete, all of that manure, basically a waste, will build up, and they end up scraping it out into a big slurry or a big pond. But there's problems with runoff. There's a lot of runoff, and also there's other issues with how to take care of it. It is common, though, for the industry to come in and take the manure from a slurry pit or a pond and spread it out on their fields to fertilize pastures. Now, in summary, though, from this lesson, less cows are producing more milk. It's the trend, especially here in the United States. Reproduction is very, very difficult. It's hard to get dairy cows pregnant, though to be profitable in the industry, the cows need to be pregnant and give a calf about every 13 months. There are quite a few diseases that can cause issues, but a major one is mastitis, and it plagues the industry because it can go unnoticed. It can be infectious from animal to animal. It affects the products of milk and can cost a lot of money. And finally, cheese is the major product currently, where it occupies over 50% of the dairy industry. Thank you.